right, so welcome, folks. Present our PowerPoint for today, which is lecture number 5 on mass media and culture. It's the 12th of October, morning, and this lecture is on, I suppose, the novel and its ideologies, but the reading was Oscar Necht, his essay, all right, Mass Media, Tools for Domination and Instruments of Liberation. So I'm presenting Oscar Necht now because he is a Frankfurt School thinker, but of the generation after Adorno, right? So to try, or even maybe almost 2 generations after Adorno anyway, still alive today, and interesting. But I still am really talking about the Frankfurt School, and I'm interested in what they have to say about Robinson Crusoe, or about the novel in general, the novel as a kind of mass communications form. We might normally not think of the novel as media nowadays, because media for us means somehow electronic. But a wider definition of media has to include everything from printing onwards, all right? Because that's what media is, medium of communicating ideas. So I guess language is also media, and that goes from before the printing press and all of that. But let's say the novel is 300 years old or so. Robinson Crusoe is 300 years old, 303 years old. Other novels we'll talk about, Don Quixote, for example, much older, well, not that much older. Many people have commented on Robinson Crusoe, so here's a good example of how ideology of the novel sets up a set of ideas in public, and that's a mass phenomenon, the sending out of the core ideas, which is put into the public sphere, what's called the public sphere by Oscar Necht, and the person he was an assistant to, Jürgen Habermas. Not going into Habermas, you can look up all that stuff in some kind of dictionary or history of philosophy. Habermaniacal, we used to joke about Habermas's style. Habermas was a colleague of Adorno as well. But the discussion of the meaning of Robinson is not just about the novel, it's the ideas in the novel that get discussed. Robinson on his island and so on. Last year when we talked about Robinson in the class, different people, we were in the middle of lockdown, so it was interesting to talk about being isolated on an island. We're not quite in the same situation, and maybe a year on, people are a bit less keen to just talk still about quarantine. The assessment for the course was a series of films people made, and some people made some very interesting films about what it's like to feel like you're in quarantine and your only communication is letters in a bottle thrown from the island. You know, the classic Robinson kind of experience. I don't know where we'll go this term, this year, but we will discuss that. But still, I wanted to still talk about Daniel Defoe's novel and Robinson Crusoe, because it's really still for our times, even though it's 300 years old. It has so many different dimensions: ecology, economics, colonialism, borrowing of texts. In some sense, Defoe was a plagiarizer. He copied from William Dampier, for example, which has a Vietnam connection and all. Anyway, so we are talking about that today. And then in the second part, or the very last part, I want to introduce the Casa Grande group and their attempts to popularize poetry. by bombing people with poems. Anyway, that's if we get time. So that's where we're going to go today. Oscar Necht. All right, here's Oscar Necht sitting happy in his study. In that picture, looks to me like he's sorted all his red books to be in the frame. No, some red books in the other shelves, but he certainly put a majority of red books there. He was born in 1934, philosopher, media theorist, at Leibniz University in Hanover, a university named after the philosopher Leibniz, a student of Adorno at Frankfurt after the war, and he was assistant to Habermas, as I said. But he found his fame, first of all, by writing a survivor's tale of his experience in the camps in Denmark, actually. His family fled the Nazis, but were caught up and were in camps in Denmark for, I think, 2.5 years. And he writes about that and what happened afterwards when he came back to Berlin, which had been liberated by the Soviet Union, but then experienced some difficulties in East Germany and eventually fled to West Germany. And he wrote this book about this. Right? Subsequently, he's worked with Alexander Klug. They're over there. Alexander Klug is a really interesting guy who's made an immense amount of work and continues to produce work. But his, I think, most ambitious was his attempt to do what Eisenstein didn't do. The Soviet filmmaker Eisenstein wanted to do but didn't do. Klug attempted to make a film version of Marx's Capital, Volume 1, and that exists, but it's very long. They worked, Klug and Oscar Necht worked together. Maybe their most significant of several books that they've done together is History and Obstinacy. It's very interesting, big fat book. And but Necht's most famous book, The Public Sphere and Experience. I mean, after his escape story, his refugee story. Where he talks about the public sphere. He also introduced us, he's very well known as having written a book on Alfred Sohn-Rettel, who's another Marxist theorist who talks about abstraction. But then we'll be diving deep into esoteric, theoretical abstractions about Marxist interest. Anyway, but Oscar Necht, right? And we've read him and his article on the Frankfurt School, Mass Media, Tools of Domination or Instruments of Liberation? There's a classic question. Is the mass media imposing ideas upon us in order to get us to accept the capitalist way of life or the status quo, or in another regime, the rule of the Führer, or so on? Or is there liberation in this media, the possibility of opening up the media to liberation, whether it be through collective expression? Think of Gandhi and India and the importance of media for the independence movement, or a more personal, identitarian or democratic thrust, right? You can express yourself in social media, something like that. That's not exactly this discussion, but that shows that the discussion continues to be relevant. Very much so. Okay. And he's also presenting aspects of the Frankfurt School's communications analysis. Now that sounds very dry and boring, but he does it in an interesting way. I guess the first question that might come up for us is whether or not going back to the Frankfurt School's analysis is justified, since they were writing their most interesting media stuff in the 30s, or from the 30s onwards. think of Horkheimer and Adorno's Enlightenment, Dialectic of Enlightenment, or more importantly, perhaps the essays of Benjamin or Kraker, Siegfried Kraker, things we've talked about already. And that question, I think, is quickly dealt with. Does it need an update? Well, yes and no. You wouldn't try to, well, you would talk about Marx in a similar way, right? That's 200 years old, 170 years old for the Communist Manifesto, yet still seems very relevant if you think about the new context, right? And don't read it as gospel. In the same way, Adorno should not be read as if everything Adorno said will be, needs not to be rethought for a new context. But he would laugh at anyone who thought you didn't have to do that. And in fact, Marx too, of course, was already, can we just note that in the photograph here, Oscar Necht holding a copy of the German edition of Capital, I think. And you can see he's got the German collected works of Capital and what looks like some other collected volumes of other thinkers alone. So he's got a nice library, but for the picture, and I've seen a couple of pictures like this, he's holding Marx. Anyway, Marx, of course, was all about having readers learn something new, read Capital, but this raises, I think, an interesting question for who the readers of Marx should be, or who the readers of the Frankfurt School should be, or why we are reading them. So the first thing to think of is who did Marx think he was writing for? And Gayatri Spivak talks about this in interesting ways. So of course, he immediately wrote in German, and he effectively wrote for the German working class, the Social Democratic, then Workers' Party, the members of the advanced industrial proletariat in Germany. Even though he wrote about England, he said something like, narrator et fabula, quoting Dante. He says, the story, the names might be changed, because he writes about English capitalism in England. The names might be changed, but the story is told about you. And he means by you, the German working class. And we, as readers of him 200 years later, have to think, well, the story is told about our situation as well. And now it's not just English capital. That's he's still talking about English capital, but it's global capital that we should be looking at. Already Marx was thinking of his audience more widely just 5 years after the publication of the first volume of Capital. Volume 1 came out in Hamburg in 1867. 5 years later, in 1872 to 75, or 73 to 75, depending on who you read, Marx was rewriting it in French for the French working class. And why? What had happened? I've got asked why 1871 is important. By now, I've probably used this example a few times in classes, so you can tell me if you already guessed. Why would Marx want to rewrite Capital in French in 1872, 73? Anyone? Okay, so a very important part of history of Europe, but of world history. The first attempt at a proletarian, a workers' government anywhere in the world was the Paris Commune, which happened for just a few months before it was repressed, brutally repressed by the French state, the army in alliance with the German army who'd surrounded, basically occupied France. The first workers' government lasted in Paris for 100 days or so, was the Paris Commune. the communards, those that put up the barricades, and succeeded where in 1848 the revolution had failed and really fulfilled the hopes of the original French Revolution. And Marx recognized this as the first time the workers had put in place a workers' government. And it was just Paris, and it was crushed, and maybe he thought, even Marx probably thought at the time, it was not the right time for this because it was going to get crushed, but it had to be supported, and he supported it brilliantly. Like refugees from France coming to England, stayed in his house. He wrote articles in the press defending them and just denouncing the attacks and the murders of the leadership of, and many of the members of that Paris Commune. And his son-in-law was a fighter in the Commune, a communard. So it makes sense that Marx wanted the ideas, and this is the idea of putting out media, the ideas of capital to be available to the French working class as well. Previously only available to the German working class, and actually not even selling that well. In the first few years, 1,000 copies are made and they still hadn't sold out. Maybe by 1871 it sold out, and they started to think about a second German edition, which was going to be changed according to the rewrite that Marx was doing for the French edition. So, and that's interesting. His audience changes, and it's kept changing since, and now the audience is worldwide, and part of that history. There was a revolution in Russia and many other places, and allegiance to these ideas is at one point was more than a third of the world, getting to half of the world, and working class movements all over, although that's been beaten back in many places. There are still some countries that have allegiance to the ideas of Marx, as we know, where we live. So what is it that justifies going back to these old ideas? Is that the very introduction to that book, Marx says to his readers, the point is not to just learn these things off by heart or something. It's to really engage in research and investigation, to learn something new with the concepts that are being deployed. And he would certainly be very clear to people writing to him from Russia, taking the book, that it wasn't to be taken as anything more than a sketch of how things had played out in England, and that was not a model to be imposed on the rest of the world. You had to do that work for yourself. So read the text, but think of it in your new context, right? And that's very important, and that's kind of what Knecht is saying about the Frankfurt School. Now, what's important about the Frankfurt School is you had to evaluate the new context. A new context for thinking about a social analysis or even a political analysis is the appearance of, in the 30s, in the first half, and even more so in the second half of the 20th century, theories of language, linguistic philosophy, speech theory, language theory, Saussure, the sign signifier, all of the things that became really popular with structuralism and post-structuralism in the second half of the 20th century were really formed in the first half of the 20th century. Saussure and I guess Levi-Strauss is the one who made Saussure really, took up really Saussure really famously in anthropology, but others as well. Jacques Derrida later on too. And Knecht wants to point to that and say, well, thinking about Frankfurt School critique means recognizing that this question of the social significance of their analysis must be measured, gauged in the context of many discussions about language and focus on philosophy of language. But he wants to make a critique of that and suggest that talking about language, speaking or not speaking, is the way in which you speak is not enough. That there needs to be a social theory and an analysis, right? Speechlessness, the potential for violence, manipulative use of language as a tool of domination requires us to have a theory that's outside the theory of language, how language works, right? You got to recognize, first of all, how language works, but then the violence of language and the manipulation of language for political ends requires a theory that's bigger than the theory of language. That's what it's going to say is our new context, right? And that's where the public sphere is important. The idea of a place in which ideas are being discussed in language, but the formation of that public sphere is what needs to be theorized, right? And needs to be done critically and while recognizing that language and communication is important, but to say that it's what's his point here? He's trying to convey the idea that there's a problem with constructing the Frankfurt School or the role of the analyst as somehow then applying critical thinking to language and communication as a supplement to a theory of language, right? That's a mockery of the role of the analyst. If you're only saying, right, there's like the dominant theory of language, and then some people, just a few of them, they're really radicals, will come and do a critique of that, and that will supplement things. Well, that sort of allows the domination of the theory of language to be primary. And it's got in mind there a number of different theorists. I mean, I guess in one sense, one of the people that Adorno was very critical of, Martin Heidegger, is behind this question. This is Martin Heidegger. And you can imagine Adorno might be critical of someone who sported a little, almost Hitler-like mustache, and in fact was in the Nazi Party for a time. Huge debate we could get into for a long time about that. But the big debate still is not that, right? The big debate is this question that's key to next article. And over we keep on coming to those. The newspapers, the radio, there's television, there's video, DVDs, email, internet, the Walkman, the fact that you can move with MP3s, social media, whatever is next. Are these a potential for liberation or new folds in domination? Right. Now, Heidegger is interesting, just as an aside. I mean, with the proviso that you know that he was caught up in Germany and succumbed to, made the wrong decision, absolutely wrong decision of joining the Nazi Party. In 1933, well before the war, and yet he stayed until after the war a member of the party. But in 1933, he answered Hitler's call, so to speak, and became the Vice Chancellor of Freiburg University, the rector, and gave an address saying that the Nazi Party was the embodiment of the spirit of Germany. And now he thinks that very quickly he recognized that as wrong, but he still remained in the party and worked as a censor during the war. Like, he was a bit too old to be a soldier, but he wore this kind of militaristic jacket and so on. Anyway, his philosophy though in the 20s was amazingly important, and so a part of the theoretical background that Knecht is talking about, where he asks questions about being, what it is to be, to be in the world, and that philosophy was influential beyond measure on Jean-Paul Sartre, on Hannah Arendt, his sometime girlfriend, it turned out, or lover at least, Jewish herself, so that complicates matters. Influential on the existentialists, and then on the structuralists, Foucault, for example. Heidegger's got this one essay I refer to a lot called The Question Concerning Technology. And it's interesting because in that question, he kind of says a similar thing. If you're asking whether or not a technology, a form of communication, for example, is a tool for, is a tool, or if you're asking about any tool, whether it's good or bad, you've kind of already lost the question. You've already been caught up in what it is that technology does. Technology is already a way of framing a whole world. It's a way of thinking the world. If you think of technology, techne, how to do things, you already are in a, do things for good, do things for bad. You're already in a world where you're asking about how does a human manipulate the environment. So you made a separation, you made a whole series of value judgments before you even ask, is a technology good or bad? The world is inframed by the technology you choose. So Heidegger uses the example of the mining industry. Weirdly enough, he could have chosen the concentration camp, but he didn't. He wrote this essay just after, after he's given up allegiance to the Nazis, but still during the war period. The first draft is 42, I think, and it's published afterwards, after the war. He uses the example of the mining industry, right? So the technology of the mining industry is one where you can scrape off the top layer of the surface of the planet and add the ore, the minerals under the planet in order to use them for, I don't know, making mobile phones or whatever you're doing with them. For him, the technology of mining, asking whether that's good or bad, misses the point. You've already treated the world as a resource that you can use. You've already accepted the idea that you can exploit to advantage natural resources. So you already accepted the language of natural resource as opposed to, I don't know what, cultural or something else, right? The whole set of definitions in language have already smuggled in, if you like, the ideology of, in a way, capitalism now, that you can look at nature as a source for profit. You can look at the planet as something to be used by humans, or animals as something to be used, eaten, whatever, farmed. So it's not the technology that does that. It's accepting the ideology, the framing of that world like that, because other worlds are possible. But unfortunately, they're not really possible to us because we think through our manipulated framing. Our being is within this technological world, which sees the environment as a place where we go and do things. We manipulate aspects of the environment largely for profit, for the benefit of a few humans, and we exploit the others. Anyway, I'm not talking about Heidegger today, but if you're interested and want to get into Heidegger's thinking, recognize that he's also compromised because he's involved in the National Socialist Workers' Party. They're Nazis, and that's an issue, but there's a huge debate to be read around that. But there's also some very interesting and provocative ideas, especially in this essay, The Question Concerning Technology, but also in his big book, Being and Time. The second half on time, well, the second half on care, actually, he doesn't get to finish, but I mean, it's there, and Heidegger specialists will go deeply into that. But accessible in a way is this question concerning technology, and very interesting. We already thrown into a world where the definitions that we're born into in language already have structured the world such that there's us and the world that we manipulate. And that manipulation, irrespective of which technology we're using to do it, is what he wants to focus on. Anyway, side issues from Necht. Necht is not talking about that, but in a way, I think Necht is skip the slide here. Hang on. Necht is keeping in mind Heidegger when he talks about this question of potential liberation or a new domination. So we're going over the same old debates, perhaps deja vu, right? It means you have that feeling that you've been here before. It's almost like every generation reinvents this question in a different way. And do you really need that critique, skepticism towards social media that sort of it's almost part and parcel of the nature of the thing that, I mean, Zuckerberg for Facebook or these guys going up in rockets, they almost invite the critique. They're so obscenely wealthy and banal at the same time, right? The trouble is that we don't connect so often the skepticism we have about them, they're just going off in rockets into space for why? For their own ego, to each other generation's critique of media domination. And we can. I mean, you take the hype of the California ideology that was promoted by, the propaganda machines of the Hollywood new media, West Coast California new media hype in Silicon Valley and so on, saying, this new thing, the web and or the well, as they first called it, and social media, etc. Computing, a computer in every home is going to transform life for the better, etc. And it certainly transformed Bill Gates' life, perhaps for the better, although he's got marital troubles now, hasn't he? But we don't. Skepticism is not against the Californian ideology. That's just like West Coast hype trying to sell their new product. Is not connected to the way in which we're kind of reinventing the critique, whether we could think about encoding, decoding from the message theory of Stuart Hall, or back to, as Necht is saying, the Frankfurt School, or to science Saussure, that signified there. Yeah, so in this sense, going back to novels is an interesting way to open up this, I think. And that's what I want to do, rather than get so deeply into Heidegger, or even focus on what the Frankfurt School, the nitty-gritty of their debates. We ask these questions, and these are the questions that I've asked in the attendance thing. Why is it that the critique of social media and our skepticism to it, right? And I guess it takes some takes on some specific aspects, right? Our debate about social media is different to the debate about broadcast television or domination by newspapers by Rupert Murdoch, someone like that historicizing it. You've got to remember the questions who, what, and where. Murdoch had control of the newspaper empire, still does, but there was more discussion of it 2 generations ago. Maybe the kind of questions that belong to each epoch of critique and skepticism against domination of media are particular. Like, there wasn't the concern 30, 40 years ago when people raised the issue of newspaper barons, these guys like Murdoch and so on, who Kerry Packer in Australia, Northrop, various figures, had too much power because they owned the newspapers. That was the discussion, that they were editing the newspapers, and they were each newspaper was biased in favor of this government or this party or so on. But there wasn't a discussion, for example, about children are spending too much time reading newspapers or too much time reading. Right? That was never an issue. Whereas with social media, we're all very much focused on the kids are spending too much time with their screens, or people are walking around sitting in, you go to London. Mark Fisher talks about this in his talk, and everyone's looking at their screen on the tube. Everyone, like, it'd be unusual if someone wasn't looking at a screen on a train nowadays in London. You might even think, what's that person up to? Why are they not shackled to their device? Right? Someone who doesn't spend their time checking, it's obviously up to something else. So why are they different, you might ask? But the thing is, the questions that we're asking about a specific social media can be informed by the ideological formation of other forms of media. So the questions that are asked about the newspaper, or about, I don't know, with television, with the advent of home videos, and with so many new channels that you subscribe to, a big discussion was about pornography, and did pornography lead to violence, right? Or children's television, the discussion was, do these cartoons about the Roadrunner and the coyote, the coyote always getting hit by a truck and things like that, does this lead to is that destructive of the mind of children? But those kind of questions can be explored and maybe brought back to inform our critique of social media today. So this is what Next gets into. Communication also fortifies barriers which separate human beings from each other. Well, we've got ways in which we see that happening today. All right, there was a sense in which maybe radio, for example, we spoke about last night, brought people together. You come together to listen to the Orson Welles hour on the radio together. But there's also a sense in which everyone was listening to someone from afar. They weren't talking to each other in a way they might have been when they sat around and discussed, I don't know, father read out a novel and then the family discussed whether they liked it or not. I don't know whether that really happened. Anyway, yeah. Necht is, in fact, arguing that for being more historically, should be patterns, not patters. Historical patterns, plus empirical studies and studies of objective class. Here he's saying we need to learn from the different periods of discussion of media for our analysis of what's going on today and our deployment of theoretical material, class analysis, to help us understand what's going on today. I've added then a question about Lazar's field, because I don't know if you noticed earlier in the lecture, I said that Adorno had gone to New York and he worked for Lazar's field, but was very critical of that project. Well, it's interesting to see here Knecht correcting the story about Lazarsfeld and saying, that Lazarsfeld is the one who makes a distinction between administrative and critical communications research. Exactly the critique that Adorno had of Lazarsfeld. So when I say that this is difficult stuff, if someone picked up on that from the reading, that's a sign you're reading closely and well. But I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I do want you to explore that and think about this. What Knecht says, and he says it in different ways in various places, that the media do not constitute the core of critical media theory, or that a media theory cannot have the media as its framing. If it does that, it becomes market research. You really need to bring class categories or historical awareness and empirical field work methods or something like that to the media in order to be able to have some perspective on the media. Because if you're framed within the world of media analysis and you remain only within that media bubble, you can't really see. Well, we probably need a dialectic of being inside and outside that media, because the outside is always being drawn into what is the media, which is in a way is kind of what I'm playing at when I want to take on the question of the novel as an example, as a case study for this lecture, thinking about how the novel put ideas into the public sphere, right? So something that was in a way outside of our idea of media, historicized, we expanded to include it, the novel in media, is drawn into the same theoretical framing. But let's look at Don Quixote, right? The first big novel, certainly according to Foucault, according to many, an example of. There are many other examples, but Don Quixote is really the big one that comes out as like a discrete book. Interestingly, it's a very postmodern novel, even though it's 400 years old, 1605, because it starts off with a guy who is telling the story to some others on he's coming back from the war, I think, and they're on a transport, right? So that's the setting. And he's telling the story about having found a book, and then going through this book about the story of Don Quixote de la Mancha and Sancho Panza, his assistant, and these are drawings by Henri Daumier and paintings by Daumier. Has these adventures, and then weirdly, and maybe you've seen the story of Don Quixote, weirdly, the story breaks off just as Don Quixote is charging to fight with, I think it's the Knight of the Mirrors, and then the novel says, and this is where the text that I'd found breaks off, and we get back to the ship where the story is being told, and the author, who's Cervantes, tells them, but then some years later I discovered I found the rest of the story in a different volume. And he continues. So then it's, and what's interesting is that the first part was a Moorish, like a Muslim author, and so not really to be trusted. And then the next part is the true history of Don Quixote in a way. It's actually all of part one. There's a part two written in 1615, 10 years later. Right? And there's a false part too as well, but we won't necessarily get into it. In the story, this is Gustave Dor's portrait. Don Quixote fights with windmills, and the idea here is this: Don Quixote is serving an ideological function. It's a man that was deluded because he thought that he could live in the then 18th century with the ideals of chivalry from the 13th century. But it turns out that when he's craziness, right, he fights against windmills, and against there's some police have taken some prisoners, some men, and he sees these police as demons and devils. Metaphorically, it's a critique of power and a critique of domination of the environment of the feudal system or the early capitalist system. And in a way, it's putting out the idea of right behavior. The ideology of novels was to put into the minds of the public, the people reading the novels, kind of little stories, allegories, metaphors, tales that could show them, even by showing someone crazy, show them the right things to do, right? To affirm the values of village and family and right behavior and respect for authority, perhaps, or all sorts of things like that. Now, it's not the case that Cervantes is the only epic that does, or novel in the world, or the first one in the world that did this, right? We can, in other places, go to other stories that did exactly like that. I don't know where we could go. I've chosen a few. The Mahabharata in India, for example. An epic story, a poem of 100,000 verses, telling the story of Maha, great Bharat, India, right? And the values of being a good Hindu, or being a good member of the society, are portrayed in this story. Although it's lush enough that those reading it say, because it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old, there could be 200 years between different readings of the same text, and those different readings, because of the context, can mean completely different things, right? So that, I don't know, want to avoid getting too deeply into the Mahabharata because it's such a great story, and you know, it's about Arjuna, the archer, and the elephant-headed god Ganesh, who should be the patron saint of students, because he's writing down this story, the Mahabharata, at the request of the novelist, without stopping, and that's why an elephant-headed human was chosen. And he is the patron saint of students because he's so dedicated to not stopping that when his pen runs out of ink, he snaps off his tusk and keeps on writing. As we see from any, I don't know where my Ganesh is, statues of Ganesh. But I took a class once to the to the museum in Ho Chi Minh City, and we looked at the Ganesh in the Cham sculpture, and yes, it does have a broken tusk. Anyway, here in this picture, you see Krishna standing up, the blue god, right? And he's agreed to fight in the war between the two families. That's basically the story of the Mahabharata, an epic battle between two families of brothers. And Arjuna, who's said, I don't want to fight because I look across the battlefield and I see on the other side, they're my cousins and my teacher and so on. This fight. And Krishna explains to him that he's a warrior, and so his role is to be a warrior. It presents the ideology of the society at the time, and many times, and of course interpreted over and over. Basically, in this section of the Mahabharata called the Bhagavad Gita, he puts forward the ideology of karma and yoga. The yoga in the sense of you must attach yourself to God without thinking of anything but love for God, or another kind of yoga is through knowledge or through meditation, and accept your lot. Basically, you're a warrior, you're not a servant, and so on. You're in the social system, and you have to play that role. And similarly, a person who's a servant should be as good a servant as they can be, and then in the next life, karma will be such that they'll come back with a more blessed birth. Or if they get to the top of the rankings or whatever, somehow it's like a ranking system, they can pop off and not ever have to go back into the cycle of birth. And Krishna uses different devices in the poem to show Arjuna this. At one point, he kind of touches Arjuna on the tongue, weirdly, and Arjuna has a vision of Krishna's real existence. And inside Krishna's folds of his cloak or dhoti or whatever are the whole of the universe. So it's like a hallucinogenic experience. Whole universes are inside the universe that is Krishna, but Krishna is the God. The point is that the values of Hinduism, right practice, and how people interpreted them in different periods can be read into the story. It's very useful as a ideological frame. Another example, and much older than Cervantes, Don Quixote is Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, right? The story of Ulysses and Menelaus, the Greek kings who sail to Troy because Helen has been kidnapped by the gods, by the Trojans on the say-so of the gods. The most beautiful Helen, the face that launched 1,000 ships. Well, the 1,000 ships have gone to Troy to lay siege on Troy to get her back. And various adventures happen. Achilles, who can't be killed because he was dipped in the river, and except for the bit where he's being held by his ankle. So his Achilles heel is where he gets an arrow eventually and therefore dies. He's otherwise immortal. And the Trojan horse and all these. So values about an ideology of deception, of right practice, of bad practice, of jealousy, all these things are played out in this novel, which is put into the public as a set of ideas for the public sphere to use to think about their own lives. That's be true also of Ibn Tufail's Hayt Ibn Tajan, which is really a very fascinating Arabic philosophy story, a philosophical tale it's called, but there is a forerunner to Robinson Crusoe because it's a man who is stuck on an island on his own, talking and thinking. And this was translated, I'm rushing now a bit, but this was translated and available in 1711 in England, so could well have been seen by Daniel Defoe. There's no proof he saw it, but the idea was around, certainly being discussed in Oxford and Cambridge and so on, because it had been translated in Oxford. Just 8 years before Defoe wrote Robinson Crusoe. Yeah, I've got it. It's a beautifully translated edition, gold and so on. Here is Defoe himself. He's got some hair, hasn't he? He was a curious figure, Defoe, in the business of producing all sorts of texts, born in 1660, so just around the time of the Great Fire of London and the plague. He wrote a book about the plague. He wrote political pamphlets. He wrote a novel about a prostitute who becomes saved. He wrote anything and everything he could write to survive, for money, to get out of debt. And at times he was in so much debt, he was put in prison. He tried to get into business and sell bricks, so to start up a business, but that failed, or the timing wasn't quite right. And he was put in stocks. Do you know what stocks are? The English had this shameful public sphere practice, right? So if you didn't pay your debts, you were put into there was a piece of wood with a like shape like that. You put your head in there and your arms through 2 holes here, and it was clapped on a piece of wood that held you in place. And you had to stand there for however many days in public, where people would then throw rotten vegetables at you, throw tomatoes and so on. Although when Defoe was put in stocks, apparently the public knew that he was probably not as bad as all that, not guilty, and they didn't throw vegetables at him so much. Anyway, he writes this book, Robinson Crusoe, and it really is the ideology, the ideas of then emergent capitalism. What is Robinson Crusoe, right? Robinson Crusoe is this guy who's a young man who wants to make his way in the world. He disobeys his father, right? There's a moral in the story already. Do what your father says. And he goes off and has adventures at sea. He's kidnapped and then escapes, taking one of the Arabic, basically a kid with him that he kind of takes as a servant. Ends up going to Brazil and buying some slaves and starting a plantation. But on the way back on another trip going to Africa to get more slaves, is shipwrecked. Everyone on the ship escapes and leaves him there for some reason. I don't know why. I can't remember why. It's not explained why. They just disappear, and he's alone on the ship near the island, and he survives. In the first months, he's able to bring a lot of things ashore from the ship as it's sinking on the rocks, right? On this deserted island, apparently, he drags gunpowder and tools, hammer and nails, and some tobacco and some seeds, corn, and then he builds a life on the island. He builds his own life. And this is what's important, and so many commentators since have written about it, like famously Marx talks about Robinson Age, but he's critical of the earlier economists who talked about individualism and Robinson, or Adam Smith, Ricardo, people like that, who talked about Robinson's self-organizing, he basically works to a timetable. He understands labor theory. He knows that if he puts in so much work, however long it takes him to build a chair, to build a table, to do his garden, and so on, we see, according to the commentators on this novel, we see an illustration of the values that are important for building our economy. Individualism, timetable, bookkeeping, determination, long-term plan, daily dedication, industriousness, individual reliance, right? Not giving up, saying, well, actually, when you read the novel, that's not the only interpretation you could make. I mean, there are so many different spins on it, okay? He's either like illustrated classic. He looks like, I don't know, a 70s rock star in that one. In the middle one, I think that's an earlier one. He's moving from the shipwreck, and he's got goats and a parrot. He obviously wouldn't have had a parrot so quickly. He's in the novel, when you read it, he's afraid mostly. He spends the first couple of years on the island building barricades, a fortress. So that's another part of the ideology of the novel, that your economy needs to be protected by a fortress. But it's a barren island, not a barren island. There are no people on this island. Well, eventually there are people, right? How many of you know the story of Robinson, that eventually someone turns up? Do you know who turns up? in Robinson Crusoe who visits the island? Anyone? So you've not read the text. I'm not giving anything away. One thing is surprising though, even if you've seen the film, Robinson is there for 25 years, but eventually then the Spanish come at the end. That's correct. But first someone comes, the footprint, you know, the famous footprint that he finds in the sand. Well, he finds a footprint in the sand and he freaks out. Right? He's been there 25 years alone. And then he finds a footprint of a human, right? Somebody answered. I read it a kid, you forgot. Yeah. It's the footprint of what he thinks is of a savage, a native from the coast, which is either off the coast of South America or Africa or the Caribbean or somewhere, a native, and he observes them. They come again soon after because he's now afraid that someone's on the island. He's watching out. He sees someone else come, and it's some savages who have some prisoners that they're going to cook and eat. Cannibals. All right, so that's why he's got he gets his hunting gun out to protect himself. He's not been using the gun to hunt that much because he's cultivated some goats. Or in the version that Marx uses, which is a German children's story version, they're llamas. But anyway, Marx is not wrong. He points out that he knows full well the kids' version is different to the Defoe version. Anyway, he's not hunting. He gets his gun out because he's wanting to defend himself from the savages who are cannibals. Like the great fear of Europeans at the time going out into the world was that other people were not civilized. They were going to eat you, put you in a pot and eat you. Scared. He was paranoid. Anyway, then he saves one of these victims of the cannibals, and it turns out to be Friday. Right? And there are all sorts of subsequent interpretations of Friday as the slave of Robinson. And why does Friday, even like out of gratitude for being saved, he becomes his servant? Post-colonial readings and so on. I don't know if any of the covers show Robinson here. Robinson, yeah, you see him fighting off the savages, and then leading. Yes, the Spaniards do come, and he leads them to. He saves them as well, and eventually gets them home to England. That's in volume 1. Actually, there are 3 volumes of Robinson Crusoe. The second volume. He goes back to the island. It turns out that so he's been away for 27 years, but remember he had bought some slaves in Brazil and set up a plantation there. All that while, that plantation's been making money. So when he gets back to England, it turns out he's rich. His wife, who he hadn't seen for 27 years, is quite happily separates with a payoff, and he gets married again. And then, because he's an adventurer type, in the second volume, he goes back to the island to help the people that he'd left there, some of them he'd left, and to set them up and to build his colony. And that second volume is really interesting because it talks about building the colony. And then, of all places, Robinson then says, well, the colony is all well and good. So I've built it up on that island. Now I'm going to go and trade in Southeast Asia. And he goes to Vietnam. Right? The second volume, Robinson travels and trades in Hanoi, or what was then, and in Hoi An. And the story is all borrowed from the work of a actual visitor to Vietnam at the time, an East India captain and pirate called William Dampier, right? Who's amazing. I've been writing about this, so this is why I'm talking about this. The Dampier influence on Robinson Crusoe is great. Not the first part. It was another East India captain that probably influenced the first part. There was an East India captain called Robert Knox, and he and his father were shipwrecked, well, were not shipwrecked, they were captured by behaving badly, insulting the local king in Kandy, in Sri Lanka. And they were taken prisoner in Sri Lanka and kept for 19 years. Not exactly prisoners. They were allowed to live in the village. They had their own marijuana plantation, apparently, which they brought to some samples they brought to England and introduced to the Royal Society. This amazing medicine. But they'd spent 19 years, and Robert Knox's story. I mean, he got back to England in the 1670s. His story was published by the same publishing house, or at least in the same building, as the publisher of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. So it's very clear where Robinson Crusoe story, the influence came from. Although there was also a story from William Dampier about a guy called Alexander Selkirk, a Scottish sailor that was marooned or chose to be marooned on an island called Fernandez, Ile de Fernandez, in the Atlantic for 4 years, survived for 4 years on his own. As did actually a Mosquito Indian that William Dampier writes about as well. But Dampier's travels were written up in 1699. He's famous for also visiting Australia. And his period, he's just a little bit older, a generation older than Daniel Defoe. And there's no question that Defoe, I think there's no question that Defoe follows Dampier's writings in writing about Robinson Crusoe. First, Dampier writes about the isolation of Selkirk on the island, but then the Robert Knox story fills it out a little bit. And then in volume 2 of Robinson Crusoe, when Robinson set up his colony, Robinson moves to trade opium in Vietnam, and India and Vietnam and China, right? But mostly he's based in Vietnam, which is exactly what William Dampier was doing himself. But Dampier has, when you read Dampier's text, which I have up here, beautiful Voyages and Discoveries of William Dampier, old text with one of these books where has these fantastic pull-out maps. Let me try and get it right. Okay. Which shows, does anyone recognize that? Malaysia and the islands of the Sumatra, Indonesia, Borneo. And he has this fantastic description of mangoes and mango chutney when he gets to, let me find where that is. Oh, he goes around the world 3 times. So there's his map of the world. This is very early on, right, for an adventurer. He's also a pirate, so he gets involved in some piracy and dodgy business. He writes fantastic texts on the winds and the Pacifics, and his work is enjoyed by Captain Cook, and who allegedly discovered Australia, right? Killed in Tahiti, and Charles Darwin carried copies of Dampier's books, so very influential on Defoe for Robinson Crusoe. But the bit, here it is, the bit I'm looking for, this is the other volume of Dampier's Voyages, right? The bit that I really wanted to show you as a kind of proof why it's interesting to us. He's one of the first Europeans to get to Australia. This is his map. You see a little bit of Australia, the west coast of Australia he gets to, okay? And he's one of the earliest European visitors to there it is. Does anyone recognize the shape of the island if you can't read the text? Makes sense. The text is too small. It's Paulo Condor or Condau. So he is one of the first Europeans to, well, Marco Polo was the first in 1284, and some Portuguese went in the 1600s, but in 1677, I think, Dampier goes to Paulo Condor, and he describes mango chutney. The mangoes there are the best in the world. The people are great, etc., etc. And he goes and trades opium in Vietnam. And in many ways, what the East India Company were looking for was a base halfway between China and India, so that as they went to sell the Chinese opium, they could refuel their ships and so on. And actually, a guy called Catchpole set up Captain Catchpole, 20 years later, set up a fort on the island, but the Wing Kings objected, and they organized a rebellion, and the English were basically all massacred, killed, and got rid of, because they had insulted they refused to practice diplomacy and go to Hue and give some gifts to the Wing Kings, and you know, they just assumed that they could walk into an island and set up there, even though it had been occupied for 4,000 years by people. It's a bit like contests over the East Sea today, right? The new report in the news this morning, the British are sending another warship into the East Sea. Anyway, so Dampier is a really important source of this novel for Defoe. But the point is that Robinson Crusoe, as a novel, enters into the public sphere discussion, the values of, as I said, individualism, economic self-help, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, industriousness, using tools, planning your day, but also colonizing, going and trading in the Far East, making money. It was justifying all of those things as well. And novels have always done that. I mean, of course, there's also a kind of working class public sphere, or an alternative, an oppositional public sphere, and the kind of novels that we can point to, an alternative history, would be ones like Zola, The Debacle, the critiques of bourgeois life, like The Madness of Moby Dick, Charles Dickens' Hard Times, or even some of the more esoteric things like the fantasy of Alice in Wonderland. I'm not going to explain to you why I think Alice in Wonderland is a critique of bourgeois public sphere, but if you can think of the way in which royalty is presented in that novel, the mad queen, and the stupid king, and all the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, it's a mockery of English bourgeois life. Anyway, Hard Times, a critique of the industrial north, the factory system, of Britain. Zola, Moby Dick, the hierarchy on a whaling ship of, I guess, colonialism is impeached there as well, and Zola's debacle, Marx's favorite author. I'm very aware that I've spoken for too long now, and we should take time for a break and discussion, and to do the feedback on the assignment. So let me stop this for now. We enter into a period of like a break, and give you a chance to